Welcome to Decoding Healthcare Research. I'm your host, Efrain Riveros, Dr. E. Efrain. I am an associate professor of anesthesiology at the Medical College of Georgia in the United States. Today, we are going to be dealing with a very interesting topic, the fructose survival hypothesis in the context of obesity. This is going to clarify many important aspects of metabolic syndrome and obesity and extend even those findings to other types of pathology in the human being. So we have the honor of having Dr. Richard Johnson, who published an article in Philosophical Transactions in 2023, and he's going to illustrate a little bit more about this particular topic. So I want to welcome Dr. Richard Johnson. He is a researcher from the Department of Medicine at University of Colorado in the United States. So welcome, Dr. Johnson.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
Thank you so much. So I want to start by giving a little bit of background. Obesity has been more important by the day. So you see headlines in the news, the medical literature is focusing on obesity, metabolic syndrome. And there is like a common theme across this metabolic syndrome, obesity, aging, and different types of diseases. And the common theme tends to be like inflammation, but people are asking themselves, why is this happening? And there are different theories about it. One of them is the fructose survival hypothesis that is actually has to do with an evolutionary concept, right? So I want you to start telling us, why is fructose important to that degree, to be at the very center of a theory?
Yeah, well, thank you for this really important question. And you're right, obesity and diabetes and metabolic syndrome are pervasive. They're very common. And they've been linked with not just obesity and diabetes, of course, but also with conditions like fatty liver, like high blood pressure, like dementia, like cancer. There are certain cancers associated with metabolic syndrome and obesity. And so it's more than just insulin resistance and obesity. This spectrum of conditions associated with metabolic disorders really carries to a wide range of diseases, from dementia and cancer and behavioral disorders, et cetera. Our work identified a possible driver of this metabolic disorder, and it turns out to be evolutionary based and to be really critical for survival for some animals. But when it's turned on all the time, it turns into a very dangerous condition for us that's driving a lot of diseases. At its base is the fact that we identified that that one nutrient was different from all other nutrients in its ability, in its effect on the metabolism, on metabolic energy. So let's talk about this for a moment. So, we are driven by the energy we make. So when we eat food, we use that to create energy. And that energy is in the form of ATP. Most of it is made by the mitochondria. So we have in every cell little organelles called mitochondria that churn out the ATP. And then in turn, the ATP is used by us for everything. It's the energy that drives life. And food is therefore really a source of energy that we use to make ATP. The classic thinking has been that, if you get too much energy, you fill up your cells with the ATP you need, and the rest of the energy is stored. And stored energy is fat and glycogen, but mainly fat. And we use fat as an energy source when there's no food around. So animals that are fat can survive longer than animals that are skinny, because if they're not given any food, they can use the fat they have to break it down to generate the ATP. So we get back to ATP either way we go. But basically, fat is a form of stored energy, and ATP is really the active energy that we preferentially use, when we do any kind of activity. So most foods are used to produce ATP, and so everything is just as it should be. But fructose is a specific sugar that is similar to glucose. It looks like glucose, but whereas glucose increases the energy in the cell, fructose lowers the energy in the cell. And the way it does this is it generates a substance called uric acid, which we know can cause the disease gout. And that uric acid suppresses mitochondrial production of ATP. So it reduces the amount of active energy. And so as a consequence, the calories tend to go to the stored energy. So energy balance is maintained, but at the expense that the energy is being stored rather than used to make active energy. And by dropping the ATP in the cell to like 2/3 of normal, it acts like an alarm signal to the animal to make it think that it's got a low energy state. And it does in some respects. It has a low ATP state, and that's associated with fatigue and hunger and all those kinds of things. And so that low ATP then stimulates the animal to eat and to try to store energy. So it's a fantastic system that animals use to store fat when they actually already have fat, because what they do is when they drop the ATP, this fructose also blocks the ability of fat to break down to produce ATP. So it keeps it in a low ATP state that stimulates hunger, foraging, thirst, food intake, weight gain. But it's doing it in sort of a trick system, because the animal's not actually suffering. It actually probably has enough fat stores and so forth, but it just doesn't use them when this system's turned on. And the reason this evolved was because animals know that, there are some times during the year when food is scarce, and it's true for many, many species. So, and some animals will get fat and hibernate. Others, that have to do long distance migration will store up on fat so that they can live off the fat while they're flying. And it's interesting, when fat is broken down, it not only produces ATP, but it also produces water. And so it's a source of water. There's no water directly in fat, but when you metabolize fat, you generate water. And that's called metabolic water. So fat is a major survival tool that animals use when food's not around. Some animals, like in the desert, will store fat in their tails or in their humps so that they can break it down to produce water when they don't have enough water. And some animal, like the whale, for example, will have fat throughout its body, but it uses some of it to produce water because it doesn't drink seawater. So you have these, fat turns out to be a very, very important thing that animals use for survival. And the main way they seem to do this is either to eat fructose or to produce fructose. And animals will produce fructose as well. And there's an enzyme system that can convert glucose to fructose. The only way you can make fructose is from carbs. And so things like bread and rice and potatoes that raise your blood glucose, not only does that stimulate insulin, but it also stimulates the production of fructose from the glucose. And so carbs are the primary mechanism to generate fructose, either from eating it directly, like in soft drinks or table sugar or high fructose corn syrup, or you can make the fructose from carbs, like from bread and rice and potatoes, especially the starchy carbs. And then the fructose activates the switch that makes you hungry and starts eating. But interestingly, once you start eating and you're hungry, high-fat foods turn out to be a very efficient way to gain weight, because the high-fat foods have twice the caloric content. They can make twice the amount of energy, but they also can make twice the amount of fat because they have more calories per gram. So when you're activating the switch, it helps you store fat quicker if you eat fat as opposed to other types of nutrients. So it's sort of an interesting 1-2 punch. The fructose sort of ignites the fire that allows you to gain weight, but then the calories may actually be more from the high fat foods. And so this really explains a very interesting phenomenon, which is, a lot of people will go on a low carb diet to lose weight. And of course, what we believe is that when you do that, you start regulating your weight well, so you're not going to gain weight, and you can lose weight, because when you go on a low carb diet, you kind of stimulate the burning of fat, which is one of the ways we get rid of fat. But in a low carb diet, people are often on a high fat diet. And the question is, if high fat diets are bad, how can you go on a high fat diet and lose weight? Yeah. So the trick is that when you go on a low carb, high fat diet, the low carb makes you sensitive to leptin and to hormones that regulate weight, so that you won't gain weight even though you're on a high fat diet. But if you give carbs with high fat diet, then you're going to gain weight very fast. So the Western diet tends to be high carb, high fat, and that combination is really very, very effective at stimulating weight gain.
Yeah, and one thing that I want to discuss a little bit more is the survival switch seems to be critical for exactly that, for the survival of the species over time. But you need a genetic background for it to work, and you also need a certain environment for it to work. And probably both things have changed in terms of evolution, right? So right now, our environment is not of scarcity. And but from the genetic standpoint, what happened if we compare ourselves with our ancestors?
Yes. Well, we've actually identified 2 mutations that occurred in our past that were absolutely critical for our survival, and but today are increasing our risk for obesity. This concept is called the thrifty gene, and basically it says that during the period of starvation, maybe a mutation occurred to help you prevent from starving, but in a world of plenty, now that mutation increases your risk for obesity and diabetes. So the first mutation that we identified is one involving uric acid. And remember that fructose stimulates the production of uric acid. It actually is very special for fructose, because what fructose does is it drops the ATP in the cell, right? We talked about that. And what happens is, as the ATP, there's both a decreased production of ATP, but there's also an initial consumption of ATP. And when the ATP is consumed, it activates an enzyme called AMP deaminase, and that enzyme helps sweep away the AMP from being reconstituted to ATP. So the breakdown, as ATP breaks down, this enzyme prevents the ATP from being remade. And so there's another mechanism. And actually, there turns out to be 4 or 5 mechanisms by which ATP is suppressed. But what happens is as the AMP is degraded, it produces uric acid, and then the uric acid suppresses the mitochondria further. You've got this very significant system to reduce ATP. So
you
uric
also,
acid,
okay.
yeah,
Mhm,
go ahead.
go ahead. No, I
So
was
the
going
uric,
to say that this uric acid also induces some kind of oxidative stress,
yeah,
right?
yes. So the way it does it, it's interesting. If you put uric acid in a test tube, it actually can function as an antioxidant or an oxidant, depending on how you do the reaction. But it can often be an antioxidant and made some people think that it was an antioxidant. But when it's inside the cell, it actually stimulates another enzyme called NADPH oxidase. And this enzyme is a very potent producer of oxidative stress. And not only does it stimulate it, but it actually translocates it. It helps move it from the cellular cytoplasm to the mitochondria themselves. And then when it gets in there, this thing starts to produce oxidants that really knock down the mitochondria and really impair the mitochondrial function. So the uric acid has a very important role in the way fructose works. And we discovered this a long time ago when we were studying, when we first started studying fructose. Well, I was aware that humans have higher uric acid levels than most mammals. And it's due to a mutation that occurred in our past. And that mutation occurred about 15 million years ago. So I'm a curious guy. So I said to myself, well, what was going on 15 million years ago, 12 to 15 million years ago? And I found out that it was a period of time in which the world was changing from climate change. And there, instead of global warming, it was global cooling. And I read about how 30% of all species became extinct during that time. And then I found out that our ancestors, which were really ancestral apes at that time, actually almost went extinct and actually sort of did go extinct in Europe, but only a few survived in Africa. And that it was a really rough time for our species. And it was during that time the mutation occurred. So it turned out, when you're reading about something that you're not an expert on, one of the rules is you try to find an expert. And there is a wonderful gentleman named Peter Andrews who is like the world expert on our ancestors during that time. And he works out of the Museum of Natural History in London, and he's a very, very famous anthropologist, trained with Louis Leakey. This man is incredibly knowledgeable. And I reached out to him and I told him, that I had this idea, and he invited me over to London. I went over there, I went to the museum, took me to a back room, and we sat there and we talked for hours, and he showed me examples of old species. And it was, for me, who's a kidney doctor, it was one of the special moments in my life.
Yeah.
And what he basically told me was the following story. He said that, that around 20 million years ago, the first apes evolved in Africa. These were a major breakthrough in evolution. These guys were bigger, they had bigger heads, they were tailless, and they only ate fruit. They ate 90% of their food was fruit, and they lived in the trees. And when global cooling began, it was still pretty warm, and they were doing well. They were living in kind of like tropical rainforests, but as global cooling began, the water started to fall. The water levels, instead of rising, they fell, and polar ice caps formed. And Africa had been an island. It was an island. It was separated from Europe. And suddenly there were land bridges that have formed around 17 million years ago. And when that happened, these apes, along with a ton of other species, giraffes, rhinos, aardvarks, they all made their way into Europe. And then, and in Europe at that time, the temperatures were still warm and the forests were filled with fruit trees and the animals did pretty well. But as global cooling continued, the forests in the northern climates, like in Europe, in the more north, they got cooler faster than the ones in Africa. So in Africa, the forests receded, but basically the fruit remained available all year round. But in in Europe, as it got cooler, the forest changed to more of deciduous type trees and more like open savannas. And suddenly there wasn't enough fruit all year round. And these apes started to starve. And it was seasonal starvation where they starved during the cooler months. And they actually get these rings on their teeth that look like the tree rings, which is from the poor growth of enamel in growing teeth. And so you can see evidence for seasonal starvation by looking at the rings on the teeth of the fossils. And, he had found Peter had found is that all the apes in Europe actually had gone extinct, except a few of them, and a particular species called Kenyapithecus actually made it back. They made it back to Africa. They actually originated in Europe, but they went back to Africa and survived the extinction. And they also, some of them made it their way to Southeast Asia. And the ones that went to Southeast Asia became the orangutans, and the ones that went back to Africa became the great apes and also our ancestors. And so it was amazing because it suggested that since that mutation is carried not only by the great apes and the orangutans, what it told us was, or the African great apes and the orangutan, what it told us was there was a common mutation, and the common species, the time when they were all together, was in Europe, when there was an active extinction starvation event. So we got this idea that maybe that mutation helped those apes survive, and basically had to be such a powerful mutation that it made the difference between life and death with having it. So we said to ourselves, so we know that this drop in ATP is driven by the uric acid, and the greater the drop, the more the biologic switch can be activated. And so what we did was we first took mice that have low uric acid levels, and because they have uricase, they have this enzyme, and we inhibited that enzyme. And we found that when we inhibited the enzyme, the same dose of fructose was much more potent at making them fat, at making them get fatty liver, at making their blood pressure go up. So, and it had been said in the literature by the sugar industry that fructose, in order to make a mouse fat and obese, you had to give it high concentrations of fructose, because and that wasn't physiologic because people aren't eating that much. But what we found is that when we inhibited the enzyme, we could give small amounts of fructose to the
and it's sufficient.
mice. Yeah, it was sufficient to make them fat. So then I was very fortunate to know Steve Benner, who's a fabulous chemist, who's origins of life chemist, and he's been nominated for the Nobel Prize. And he was the first one to resurrect an extinct gene, like the Jurassic Park stuff. He actually was the first one to do it. And I reached out to him, and he had trained an individual named Eric Gosher, and Eric actually is just as great as Steve. And he resurrected the extinct gene for us. And then we did studies with it, and we showed that basically when you have the gene, you can't get fat as easy. But when you get rid of the gene, it makes you much more susceptible to fructose, and it's driven through a high uric acid. So then we knew that this mutation that occurred 12 million years ago was a survival mutation that helped these apes survive. And what it did was it protected them from starvation. It didn't make them obese. It protected them from starvation. And then, but now we have this mutation that makes us more sensitive to fructose. So to kind of pursue that further, I went and looked for native cultures that weren't on a high fructose diet. And so I found out that there was a doctor in Michigan who had been to southern Venezuela, to the jungles of southern Venezuela, where he had done studies on a group of Indians called the Yanomami Indians. And these were Indians that were living on native diets in the jungle. They were eating fruit, so they were exposed, but they were eating kind of the kind of diet that hunter-gatherers might have done, centuries and centuries and thousands of years ago. And so, when we looked at their uric acid levels, they were higher than like the mouse or the rat, but they were about half the level of ours today. And then I found in the historical record that, like in 1920, the normal uric acid was like 3 or 4, which is similar to the Yanomami. But with Western diet and with the rise in sugar intake, and the rise in alcohol and all those other things that can raise uric acid, that over the last 100 years, our uric acids have gone from an average of 4 to 6 or 7. And those who are eating a lot of sugar and a lot of, it can go up to 9 or 10. And then there's a direct link with the level of uric acid and the level of obesity. So if you have a uric acid of 10, you have an 80% chance of being obese. And if you have a uric acid of under 4, it's like less than 10%. So there's this very strong relationship. It's consistent. And I think that this is a thrifty gene. It's not a gain of a mutation, but this mutation caused a loss of this gene and that controls uric acid. So we have high uric acid, and this has made us susceptible, but it wasn't enough in itself. But when you couple it with Western diet, you have a double whammy.
Yeah, and I see that the survival switch is definitely activated by fructose, but not only fructose. You mentioned in your paper that there are other stimulants as well, including salt and states of dehydration and other stuff. But before we go into those, I want to ask you, if the fructose is so important, would you be able to activate the switch just with the fructose from the fruits exclusively?
Yeah, so if you eat a huge amount of fruit, you could activate this switch, or like fruit juice. Like we can show, I can show that if you drink like 16 ounces of apple juice, we actually did it in people. If you drink it really fast, it will drop the ATP and activate the switch. Yes, so you can do it. Now, it's sort of a trick because fruit has substances that block it, as well as so things like vitamin C turns out to be an antioxidant and to block oxidative stress in the mitochondria. And I just told you that the way we activate this switch is by stimulating oxidative stress to the mitochondria. So certain fruits like kiwi that have a high vitamin C content, it may contain some fructose, but that high vitamin C content will counter and block the effects of fructose. So most fruits, a lot of the tart fruits we eat are high in vitamin C, and the vitamin C helps control this switch. But interestingly, when a fruit ripens, a lot of fruits, as they ripen, the vitamin C content goes down. What's more, the fruit gets a little mushier, so there's a little bit less fiber. And it gets sweeter. And so it's like the tree wants the animal to eat the fruit, because now you're increasing the fructose, reducing the vitamin C, and the seeds are now mature. And then when the animal eats it, the seeds will actually help the plant in a kind of a symbiotic way. But if animals don't want fruit that are immature, and the seed's immature, so it won't be a good seed, and there's not a lot of fructose and it's high in vitamin C, so it's kind of like perfect to keep the animals away. And so there's an actual story there. Now, interestingly, as you probably know, we also had a mutation in our past where we lost vitamin C. And that was farther back. And so yours truly started looking into this and wanted to know what happened when the vitamin C mutation occurred. And, it's been a controversy exactly when it occurred. But one thing I can tell you, it was really close to the big extinction event that took the dinosaurs around the KT extinction event around 66 million years ago. And it was very close to that time. And it basically affected a whole group of primates called the dry-nosed primates. Basically, most primates, but not lemurs, for example. Mm-hmm. And lemurs still make vitamin C, but most monkeys and primates do not make vitamin C. So I thought to myself, now how can we test if vitamin C could be also a mutation that might predispose us to obesity? So what we did is we took, and a lot of this work was done by Miguel Lanaspa, my right hand, and he's now a true leader, and he's driving a lot of the research. He's really, I probably should be his right hand now. But anyway, but what Miguel did was he knocked out vitamin C production in a mouse. And when he does that, the mouse has to get fed vitamin C or it will get scurvy just like us. So he put all the mice on a low dose of vitamin C to make sure that they don't get scurvy. But then he gave some a high dose of vitamin C and then measured their levels and so forth. So now he has two groups of mice, one with a low level of vitamin C and one with a high level. And then he gave them all sugar. He gave them the challenge. They all went on fructose, high fructose corn syrup, and they all drank the exact same amount. They liked it equally. But the animals that had the lower amount of vitamin C came fatter. They were significantly fatter. The switch was activated to a higher degree. And we haven't published this paper yet. I'm on it to get it out. But basically, that's another example of a survival mutation that, and interestingly, there are, clinical trials showing that vitamin C can reduce and improve metabolic syndrome. And it has a mild effect. It really has a documented effect. And it also lowers uric acid. Vitamin C will actually lower uric acid. It's a cheap way to lower uric acid, and it's a way where you can do it without having to take a drug. But it tends to only lower the uric acid, by 10% or 5 to 10%. So in many people, it's not enough, but it's a really good thing. And I think Linus Pauling, he got 2 Nobel Prizes. Well, we should have given him a third one because he was a big fan of vitamin C. I don't think his argument, he didn't quite have the same level of knowledge that we have today because of all the studies that have been done since. But I think he would have been on it if he was living today. He would have published these papers well before me. But anyway, so this guy, vitamin C is another one.
Okay, that's super important. And if we start with fructose and we end up with obesity, what happens in between? What is the pathway that leads from fructose to weight gain?
Well, there's a lot of information there, but there's there's two things I want to talk about. One is there's one pathway that is driven by calories, and there's another pathway that's not driven by calories. And this has been a big controversy in the literature, because you'll hear the low carb people say that it's not about calories, it's about the type of food. And you'll hear the energy balance people say, no, weight gain is strictly calories. And both published papers supporting their story. And it turns out that both groups are right, but not fully right. So let me, at least based upon our work, of course you could say that I'm wrong, but what we found was that when you eat fructose, remember that drops the ATP, and that stimulates weight, dysregulates your ability to control your weight. So you eat more than you want to eat. And I mean, you eat more than you need to eat, and you reduce your energy metabolism. What drives that is a process where the low ATP and the rise in uric acid affect a part of the brain called the hypothalamus. And this part of the brain is where weight regulation is controlled. And it actually, you're right, it induces inflammation in the hypothalamus that causes a condition we call leptin resistance. And leptin is a hormone that is really important in controlling appetite. And when you're young, you're leptin sensitive. And basically, when you're leptin sensitive, you will not eat more than you need. You'll fill up. When you're leptin resistant, when you eat, you'll still stay hungry. So you end up eating more than you need. It's actually a biologic mechanism that makes you want to eat more. And the leptin resistance is the key for driving weight gain. Now, if you're leptin resistant from fructose, but I only give you the same amount of food as another animal that is leptin sensitive, you're going to have no difference in weight, because the weight gain is because you eat more. So the fructose makes you leptin resistant, and that makes you eat more. And when you eat more, you're getting more calories, and it reduces your energy metabolism a little bit. And that combination causes weight gain. So weight gain is definitely calorically based, because if you only give the animals the same amount of calories, the weight gain is very, very subtle, because the decrease in energy metabolism is minor compared to the increase in energy intake. And so if you control for the energy intake and everyone eats the same, what happens is your weight doesn't go up. So it is true that weight gain is because you are hungry and you eat more than you need. That is what fructose does. But there's another side that's maybe more important. Okay, it's probably more important. And that is that even if you control the weight, even if you control how much an animal eats, if it's eating sugar, it activates other parts of the survival pathway that are not dependent on calories, such as insulin resistance and prediabetes, such as fatty liver, such as high blood pressure, such as dementia, such as kidney disease. All of these things are independent of the increase in caloric intake. And this is even crazier. Your weight doesn't have to go up, but your body composition will start shifting from muscle to fat. So you actually are fat. You do get fatter without calories, but it's not with weight gain. Energy balance maintains. It's just body composition that changes. So we actually could make a diabetic animal with high blood pressure, and fatty liver, and increased fat on a caloric restricted diet. Just make sure it had a lot of sugar. So the bottom line is, there's two mechanisms. There's the caloric mechanism that drives weight gain, and there's a metabolic mechanism that's independent of weight gain.
Yeah, and it's interesting that both of them lead to storage of fat. But I want to now to discuss something else. There are a lot of papers discussing specifically metabolic syndrome, diabetes, and the management of fat and sugar. But you mentioned something that is kind of unique, and is the role of salt, dehydration, and vasopressin, and how it is connected to the survival switch, and it kind of is, compounds the whole process. Can you elaborate a little bit more?
Yes, this was an unfortunate series of experiments because it showed it was both illuminating and incredibly illuminating, but it was disappointing because I was hoping that the problem was mainly the sugar we're eating, or even the French fries, the carbs. And I didn't really want other mechanisms to get in there because it would make it so hard to lose weight if everything, there were so many ways to get fat. But what we learned is that, this survival mechanism is used by animals not just to store fat as a way to store calories, but the survival mechanisms used by animals to store water and also to reduce their oxygen needs. So, when you make fat, as I mentioned, it can be used as a source of water. And likewise, when you activate this switch and you suppress the mitochondria are the main parts in our body that use oxygen. The reason we breathe so much oxygen, need so much oxygen, is it's used to help make energy by the mitochondria. But you can make some ATP through a non-oxygen mechanism, what we call glycolysis. And when you suppress the mitochondria, you actually stimulate ATP production by glycolysis. So you're reducing your oxygen needs, and making less ATP. You do make less ATP levels fall, but you are stimulating glycolysis, which is this non-oxygen. It does not require oxygen to make ATP. And there's two big consequences. One is when you're not making enough, when you stimulate glycolysis, this is how tumors grow, because tumors live in a low oxygen state and they love fructose. And this is, a consequence of the survival pathway is it stimulates cancer growth. And this has now been shown, Mendelian studies, experimental studies. This pathway drives cancer growth. It's bad. But it also, the dehydration obesity pathway, turns out there's so here's the scoop. If you get dehydrated, you don't want to store fat. You want to break down fat, right? If you get dehydrated, if you're really seriously dehydrated, you'd want to break down fat to produce water. So severe dehydration really doesn't cause obesity. It makes you burn fat, but it's, you're miserable and sick. And I don't recommend getting dehydrated as a way to lose weight. Do not do that, okay? But there's another way that's ironic, and that is that very, very mild dehydration, like an alarm signal, just like that low ATP. It only drops the ATP like 20%. It's not like dropping it down to near death. That's the warning that causes fat accumulation. Well, very, very mild dehydration, really mild, can act as a stimulus to store fat. And guess what the best way to do that is? The best way to create mild dehydration is to eat salt. And when you eat salt, it raises the salt concentration in the blood. But think about it, you're not losing water. You're not losing water. In fact, we now know that when you eat salt, you're not losing water. The serum osmolality goes up, and it makes you want to drink water. So it's helping you to hold on to water, but it also stimulates vasopressin, which is this hormone to help hold on to water. And what we found was a fantastic, I think actually this could be our most significant discovery, even though we don't really talk about it much. And that is vasopressin is this hormone produced in the brain that helps animals hold on to water, okay? And it usually works mainly through the kidney to block you from losing too much urine. So it reabsorbs water in the kidney to reduce the urine volume, and that actually helps reduce, helps you when you're in a dehydrated state. That's why the urine gets concentrated and yellow, right? It's because that vasopressin is working on the kidney. Well, frogs use vasopressin to help prevent water from getting through the skin. And there's vasopressin receptors in our lung that probably reduce water vapor loss, believe it or not. There's evidence for that. So vasopressin is not just a hormone for the kidney. It's trying to hold on water other ways. And so the interesting part is when vasopressin has 3 different receptors. There's the one in the kidney, which we call the V2 receptor. That's for holding on to, making the urine concentrated. There's the V1 receptor, the V1A it's called. That's the one where you give vasopressin in the ICU to help raise blood pressure because, that's a survival thing. That helps to keep the blood pressure up when you're dehydrated. But there's a V1B receptor, and no one really knew what that was. There was no function for it, no definite function. But when we knocked that receptor out, we could block how sugar and salt cause obesity. And we realized that salt activates the switch just like sugar does. It's a much slower switch, and that switch involves vasopressin. And people who are obese have high vasopressin levels. And the reason it's high is because it's binding to this V1B receptor and stimulating some of the processes that cause leptin resistance and all these things. So there is a hormone that drives obesity. Insulin drives obesity too, to some extent. But V1, the vasopressin, is another hormone that drives obesity. And it's doing it to help us hold on to water.
Yeah, and it's that complements the theory. And my final question is: there are many aspects of diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and obesity that are really explained by this hypothesis. There are still some limitations. What do you think are the gaps in knowledge that we still have?
I think there's 2 major ones. And the first one is that a lot of our work has been done in animals, laboratory animals in nature. And the number of studies in humans is not enough to be absolutely certain that this pathway is absolutely right. The data, though, looks convincing to me that there's, it's a very strong case. I think that what's been true in all these animals likely carries over to us. But a weakness is we need more clinical studies. The biggest one is is that we now know that the fructose pathway isn't just from the fructose we eat, it's also from fructose we make. And every couple of months, a new study comes out showing that we are making fructose. And one just came out showing that the oral glucose tolerance test stimulates fructose production. So we're getting there. But it seems to me the most important study will be when we have a drug that can block this pathway, like the fructose metabolism. And once we can block this pathway with a drug, we'll really be able to dissect out how important this pathway is in humans, because we can give the drug. And, and I believe that it's important in early obesity, because when you keep doing oxidative stress to the mitochondria, over time, the mitochondria get damaged. And so then they become permanently damaged. And I don't think that blocking fructose at that point is going to be as beneficial as in the early phases when it's still, the mitochondria are still pretty healthy. So I believe that this inhibitor will really, its biggest impact will be in blocking the development of obesity or blocking the development of diabetes, rather than once you've been obese and diabetic for 20 years. You know what I mean? So,
Yeah.
So I think that there'll probably be a variation.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's actually very fascinating, and I think that the application of these concepts goes beyond diabetes and obesity. There are other diseases that are critical here. One of them, obviously, is Alzheimer's disease, that can even be considered another type of diabetes. And I think that application is going to we are going to see more papers probably related to this. I want to close by thanking you for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom with us. This was really a pleasure, and the level of depth of your knowledge is something that is really a joy to listen to.
Well, thank you so much. You're very kind. I hope that, that there is more validation and verification of this work, but it's looking very strong, especially in Alzheimer's. And it gives me hope, because,
Yes.
then once we understand how it works, we'll be able to target it.
To
And
tackle the problem.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you
Well,
are
thank you
completely
very
right.
much.
Thank you so much, and we will follow up on your results, and hopefully we can meet again in the future. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. And for our audience, the link to the paper is gonna be in the description of the video. See you in the next episode.